Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us for this meetup. Just going to do the usual introduction, and Skulk will introduce our speaker for this evening. So if you're new to FEDSA, we are a front-end development in South Africa. We've been running for a number of years, doing meetups and workshops around Cape Town, and as usual, we just want to thank our sponsors. We have two recurring sponsors. That's NML, who've been sponsoring us since 2012, and IO, who came on board a few years ago to help with sponsor by Liesel, who is a good friend and supporter of ours. Right, we've just got two upcoming things in July. The dates are not confirmed yet, but we will be posting those as soon as we have confirmation. We have another Q&A session, this time with Stephanie Steinmack, who used to work on the Edge browser, and she was led the team there who were redesigning form and input controls in collaboration with the WebKit team, and not WebKit, with the Chrome team. So that should be really fascinating. And then we're also planning another hackathon weekend sometime in July. As I say, dates to be confirmed, so keep an eye out for those on the meetup group and ZA Tech as well, where we always publish everything. Right, I'm going to hand over to Skulk to introduce this evening's speaker and topic. Off you go, Skulk.
Cool. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm super excited about tonight. Xandor is kind of one of those people that I kind of consider one of the very active voices within the world of front-end development in South Africa. If you're on ZA Tech and you're in the front-end channel, you've probably kind of seen him there a bit as well. There's a couple of people that I really kind of follow their kind of internal thoughts and discussions and so forth on specific topics. So I'm super excited about tonight in that regard. He did a talk for us, I think it's maybe even a year ago now, on design systems. So that was just when we were starting out with the streaming stuff. So it's good to have you back again, Xandor. So just on the topic of micro front end, so I'll obviously let him do a bit more of an in-depth discussion, but for me, it's something I find very interesting because I think I got into the web space where you kind of work very close to the metal, so HTML and CSS and so forth, and then over time things got abstracted, and we started kind of getting into the space of monoliths, and over time things have started to decouple and so forth. It's weird, thinking a couple of years ago, it was kind of almost like bleeding edge, this notion of actually just decoupling your front end and back end. So to me, kind of micro front ends is kind of a further step of that kind of train of thought, where now you're no longer just decoupling your back end and your front end, but you're actually just decoupling several sections of your front end from one another. So this is also kind of the areas where kind of a lot of my interests lie nowadays. So I'm super excited about this myself. Xandor, I'm happy for you to kind of give a bit more of a comprehensive introduction to the topic, and let's not waste any more time. I'll just let you get straight into it.
All right, thanks, Skulk. It's good to be back. Talking about close to the middle, I remember when I first started, I wrote my code in Notepad because it was the closest I could be to the true essence. Of course, I've learned how to do things better since then. Right. So, micro front-ends. What are micro front-ends? So, Cam Jackson, in a good article about micro front-ends, martinfowler.com, defines it as an architectural style where independently deliverable front-end applications are composed into a greater whole. That's okay. I had more points here. I don't know why they're not coming up, but basically I tackle each three parts of the statement there. So the first part is that it's an architectural style. There isn't one right way to do micro front ends. There's several ways to do it. So if anybody tells you they have the one true way, they're probably not right about that. Second part is probably the most important single defining characteristic. That is that they're independently deliverable. And that just like in microservices, they need to be independently deliverable. If you need to coordinate the release of all these things together in order for things not to break, then you don't have micro front ends. They may live on separate servers and be assembled together in the browser, but if you can't independently release a new version of one of these micro front ends, then it's not actually micro. And the third is that they need to be composed into a greater whole. Obviously, they don't just live on their own, then they would just be separate front ends instead of micro front ends. Right. So why would you want to do this? One, not getting the buttons, the different pieces. Just give me a second. Why would you want to do this? There we go. Similar reasons to microservices, actually. The biggest one would be to decouple different parts of your application and which allows you to increase the development velocity. As things are less complected together, you're able to move faster in the different areas because you need less coordination with whoever's responsible for these other parts in order to do your thing. And so this allows you to scale your engineering organization better. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with actually a very famous essay about software engineering called the Mythical Man Month. And in this essay, Fred Brooks, who worked for IBM, lays out the reasons why adding developers to a late project just makes it later. And there's natural limits to how productive you can be given a certain team size. So in order to scale your organization beyond this natural limit of team sizes, instead you need to kind of create multiple teams that can work as independently as possible. So we know roughly how to do that on the back end with microservices, and micro frontends solves that for the front end as well. But you need to be kind of like this tall to ride, just like with microservices. You can't just throw yourself at this and be like, hey, this is going to work. I actually had a client that has a fairly messy front end that has several, in theory, relatively independent features. And they wanted to adopt micro front ends actually to solve some of their architecture problems. But that to me felt like putting the cart before the horse. If you're already not good at that architecture stuff and that discipline and that decoupling, then you're not going to magically just adopt the technology of micro front ends and actually get the benefits. Instead, you're much more likely to end up with a big ball of mud that lives on several servers instead of just one. So you need to be good at testing, continuous integration, deployment, monitoring, architecture, versioning, and team autonomy. So these are, I mean, you don't have to have all these down perfect or down pat, but you certainly need to be paying attention to these areas because they enable you to do micro frontends. If you don't have this, then it's going to be very difficult to confidently independently release pieces of your overall application whenever that team has new stuff to release. If you don't have this, you're going to be way too worried about something going wrong, and things will actually go wrong. Of course, you can't have that happening. So you need to be good at these practices in order to make that happen. It's not very different from microservices in that respect at all. But maybe your front-end teams or front-end people haven't really had to worry about that competency too much themselves yet. There are definitely some risks associated with micro front ends. like I mentioned, you can end up with a distributed monolith, but just in the front end. It's totally possible to do that there, which is kind of the worst part of all worlds. You get all the costs and very few of the benefits. Best practices around micro-frontends are still kind of emerging. They're not firmly established yet. So there's a lot of more trailblazing that you need to do. There are also not as many kind of off-the-shelf utilities that you can grab, do the work for you. There are some, but there definitely is still work to be done there. It creates extra complexity in your deployment and in the browser, because it isn't just one thing that's happening now. And in the browser as well, you now have several things running at the same time that have to worry about each other, but can't know too much about each other either. Right. So unlike microservices, each micro frontend does actually not have its own execution environment. Microservices, each service lives in its own server. It's got its own execution environment. They don't, by their very nature, they don't accidentally share any data. They should have their own databases. The only way they'll step on each other's toes is if they're sending each other messages. But in micro frontends, that's not the case. They all run in the same browser, in the same process, in the same thread even, actually. And as a result, if one micro frontend has a loop that ties up the main thread, all of them are now tied up. So you can have them have kind of knock-on effects. An uncaught exception in one micro frontend could crash the whole thing. And from a security perspective as well, it isn't 100% clear, like your data, even if you do cross-site scripting protections on your frontend, if another team has a security hole, the data that you handle could still be at risk. So it certainly, there are still some things to be covered with that respect. Now, in terms of implementing
Xandor, can I quickly interrupt you? So, just some people mentioned in the comments that the audio is a little bit choppy. It doesn't seem that bad, but I don't know if there's maybe something on your side that you can maybe check out or adjust.
I could try. Well, I guess I'll hear if it's any better or not.
Well, it seems fine on my side. I just saw some comments about it.
Right.
Okay, cool. That seems all right. So let's fingers crossed.
By the way, if anybody has questions, please feed them through as well. I will have time for questions at the end, but if you have questions as I'm talking about stuff, you're welcome to feed those through, and we can address them right away also.
Yeah, I'll definitely jump in and interrupt you if there are any good questions. Cool.
Right. So in terms of implementing it, there are many ways to do it. Some people say you can do build time integration. This kind of means you have separate modules or libraries, and a build step integrates them. In my opinion, so that's not actually independently deployable, because you still integrate them together and then deploy everything as one, right? So in my opinion, this is not micro frontends. And it tends to lead to tighter coupling than what you're really aiming for. If you do it well, you can still gain some of the benefits, but it's just too easy to take shortcuts, and you end up having this kind of like tight coupling that you didn't want. So I'm going to skip over that one quickly. Server-side templating. So this actually uses a technique called server-side includes, which is think of it as like an include statement, and it's your actual web server will read through the HTML code and put a new template into where you've put that include statement. This tech is really, really, really old, which kind of also means it's rock solid. It's very unglamorous, but it's well understood. Typically, this happens using a reverse proxy. And the reason why I would use a reverse proxy is you have one main server that serves the skeleton up, inside of which you have your include statements, and it'll include things from other servers. If it's just from the same server, again, it's not really micro-frontends, because then it's just one server and it's not independently deployable. So if you have several servers, that's why the reverse proxy comes in. You'll actually have micro-frontends. So this works quite well. Some of the drawbacks here is that it's not as dynamic. Sharing data or communicating between the different micro-frontends is perhaps a little bit tricky. But it can work. Like, I've seen it work in actually large e-commerce situations, where the header and the footer is shared amongst all pages, and so actually is the cart module and that kind of thing. And then the individual product teams, and incidentally, their product team kind of actually means literal product categories of products that these teams dealt with, would handle their specific sections of the stores, their specific product listing pages and product description pages. And it was integrated using server-side includes. It worked quite well. Another one is iframes. Yes, iframes. It is clunky, but it works. Some of the challenges here are that there is limited design flexibility, because they literally are kind of like a window. You just have a rectangle to work with, and everything must work there. The nice thing about that is, though, you can communicate into and out of iframes with messages, so there is the ability to do some communication between the two if you need to do that. You can integrate with vanilla JavaScript. The way I've seen this done is using a simple kind of HTML skeleton that is a container, and each micro frontend exports a function that bootstraps it and mounts it into a provided element. And then on the main container page, you have like some simple routing logic that decides which front ends to actually bootstrap and mount onto which element in the skeleton. So this can totally work. You can use a single JavaScript framework. This actually works quite well. I've seen this with React micro frontends. They can share a single routing context that is shared amongst all the applications. I actually did not think that would work, but it did seamlessly without errors. It was very surprising. There is a little bit less flexibility, though, because if you, for example, need to upgrade React, all of a sudden that upgrade, it needs to happen in lockstep, because every one of these micro frontends is effectively using the same instance of React, or like the same instance of some of the context that's shared. You can use multiple different JavaScript frameworks. It is more difficult to get them to work together, not by any means impossible, but you don't get some of these easy niceties. And there's some common concerns that we'll touch on explicitly later, but things like routing need special attention. But it does mean that there's more autonomy for teams. Teams can decide what front-end technology they want to use to run their application. There are some risks associated with this as well. Hold on. And that is that if you don't have a component library that is shared amongst all these different frameworks, then every team has to implement the components that look the same themselves. That's a bit of a duplication of work. Or web components is another way to do this. It's a web standard, although they're not so ergonomic to use on their own. But it's pretty easy to use components from one front end in another at runtime if they support web components, because it's just a component, and as long as you have a way to render that component and it's already in scope, then you can render that component. They're also usable on their own or inside of different frameworks. So if you have a component library that is published as web components, you immediately get a nice shared experience amongst the different micro front ends, and it helps to create a kind of like seamless look and feel. There are some common concerns with micro front ends. The one is shared dependencies. I mean, if you're not careful, you can actually end up shipping the same version of React 3 times. That's not what you want to do. You can mark some of these imports that are otherwise shared as globals in Webpack, and then create kind of like a common package where you import all of these and make them available in the global namespace. That does, however, still require coordination for upgrading these shared dependencies. So that does remove some flexibility. Lately, there's this new thing called Federated Modules. This is really quite cool. It's a Webpack only technology for the time being, as far as I know. Hopefully it'll federate to other bundlers. What it allows you to do is, if you have 2 micro front ends, and whichever one loads first will ship its own version of React, and the second one, which becomes kind of like a remote, they call it, won't ship its own version of React if the host already has it. And what's really nice about Federated Modules is it can actually take into account semantic versioning. So you can actually upgrade the version of React on one of these, and if your other front end hasn't yet upgraded its version of React, you can still just deploy it. At runtime, it'll say, "Oh, hold on, wait a second. This host version of React is not compatible with me. I'm going to ship my own one instead." So it allows you to truly independently deploy stuff, and it'll share dependencies if it can, but it won't break if it can't. Routing is another concern. Now, as I mentioned before, you may actually not have to do anything special here, but at the same time, you may also have to do special stuff here. So one solution in the space is called single SPA, which single page application. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you can have a look at them, and they are like a framework agnostic way to handle the routing in between the different micro front ends. And the biggest one is sharing data. How do you actually share data or communicate between these different micro front ends? So one thing that I've seen people do is use a shared data store. In the React example, this might be using a single Redux store that is instantiated at the kind of root or container front end, and then the micro front end that comes in. They all kind of dynamically depend through the React context on this data store. I actually don't think this is a great idea. This is like integrating on the database. Imagine having several microservices that all share the same database. They're not really microservices. They're not independently deployable. To make a significant change to the structure of that data, you'd have to get all the services that depend on that data to be upgraded in lockstep. That's not just an issue at deployment time, but also in terms of the development, all the teams need to agree on the new structure and do the work in a similar time frame. It would be the same on the front end. So that's actually not great. But the browser has a built-in messaging system using events that bubble through the tree. So by using custom events, you can share data. This is nice because if you just use serializable data, then there is not actually anything shared. It just uses copies. So kind of messaging in the sense of the original object-oriented idea from Alan Kay, that kind of thing. Message passing is a really good solution to sharing data at runtime. So I've gone through this rather quickly. I had hoped to do some demos. Unfortunately, I ran out of time in preparing those. So I'm very sorry about that. But yeah. Anyone have questions?
There seems to be a couple, but I have a million, as always. So someone asked about. So this is specifically, I think they were thinking that you were like talking about a specific framework for micro-frontends. I just said like you're kind of more talking about the principle, but I think that's maybe a good. Let me just show that. So I think that's maybe like a good segue into a question around tooling. Like, so you did mention kind of you can use React, you can use web components and so forth. Are there any tools that are specifically built for micro front ends? So, in those examples, these were kind of mostly repurposing something for a micro front end architecture. I think I don't want to say canonical, but kind of I guess default way that you would think about React is through something like Create React App or so forth.
Yes, there are, but again, it's early days, and some of these that I've worked with were more kind of for educational purposes, like a Create React App thing. There is actually a fork of Create React App for federated modules with federated module support. That does exist, but there again, things are a little bit tricky. I did a proof of concept with federated modules for a client, and it's still such new tech that the articles that introduced it and that explained how to use it were actually already out of date, and following those instructions no longer worked. I had to dive deep and scroll up in Slack chat histories to try and figure out how to actually work it. And that is some of the risks with it associated as well. So, and there was a kind of, hey, just run this Create React something, but that wasn't intended to be like rock solid production stuff, because as I'm sure you're aware, Create React App is very opinionated and it's not designed to be extended.
Yeah.
And there have been discussions in Create React App issue tracker about federated modules, and they're pretty much like, yeah, this is out of scope. This is probably never gonna support that.
So I'm curious whether something like specifically when you get into the space of, you did mention, you don't accidentally want to like ship 3 versions of React and so forth, whether the like something like Learner or kind of I guess workspaces, but so there's already existing tools for kind of maintaining different packages on npm and so forth. Would those be of help in micro frontends?
Yes, although they're not technically a prerequisite. So I'm a huge fan of monorepos for these kinds of things, because they make it a lot easier to share things like type definitions, to make sure if you're doing any kind of contract-driven development that both the producer of something that should stick to a contract and the consumer of something that should stick to a contract are agreeing on the same source of truth. It makes it easier to know if there are or might be breaking changes, because it's a lot easier to know that everything in a specific set of changes should be compatible from just a static analysis perspective. Whereas if you've got multiple repositories for these things, it becomes more difficult. Having said that, making use of Yarn's workspaces or NPM's workspaces, I think they recently got support for that, or Lena for that reason, is not actually necessary specifically to do micro frontends, unless you wanted to do build time integration, which, as I've kind of touched on, is not really micro frontends. It's a step in that direction. But it isn't actually quite micro frontends because it's not independently deployable. What those features do, workspaces and Lena, is they allow you to use kind of local modules as if they had come from NPM.
No, exactly. Yeah, so granted, like I have also played a bit with micro front ends, but the cases where I've used it, it was more on kind of the light side of things. So more like web components, those type of things. I generally I didn't actually have much of a build process, so I don't really know what that would look like in a micro front end world. But I know that I did mention in the comments as well. I think GitHub is also doing a lot of exciting things in terms of kind of web components, and I don't know whether they would call it micro front ends themselves, but specifically like these self-contained like little components that kind of just use this so they just kind of talk to the server independently of whatever else is going on around them.
Well, that is a micro front end. One example of what a micro front end might be is a component that handles the add to cart functionality.
Yes.
Technically, you can do interesting things where one micro front end can actually expose or export more than one component. So let's say the cart and the add to cart button, right? It could expose both of those, and then another micro front end that integrates with that would import that button and use whatever its properties are to get it to do the right thing. But and then that button could add something to the cart. What's nice about that is it means that the cart team owns how those two things communicate internally. They can then change that, and it's not really a breaking change for any other teams as long as they don't change the interface of that add to cart button.
Yeah. So you're effectively deploying, in that case, different front ends. So what? So I think maybe also and this is kind of like one of those ontological things is I mentioned like when does it become a micro front end, and because like to me in that case so I think I've done a lot of work within civic technology and working with like the public sector and so forth, and a lot of times you build tools and whatever that get kind of deployed on existing .NET like sites or something running on Drupal or something. So those and usually the site itself is maintained by kind of a municipality or whatever, and then like you just have a specific tool that kind of they just put in an iframe or whatever, and so I've never really thought about that as a micro front end, because. But I think like the question then is like, is it an architectural thing, or is it just like kind of can you have a single micro front end, like singular, not like plural, so but yeah, like it's interesting. So what I would consider a micro front end architecture is kind of like an architecture that kind of the product itself is built on that approach, instead of something that's kind of like bolted on. Which I guess leads us to the $1 million question, which is, do you use micro front ends in production? The moment of truth.
So not right at this second. At this particular moment, I'm not involved in any projects that are doing micro front ends in production, but I have been involved with some, and I have been involved with others where we kind of tried it out as some proof of concepts, where we didn't actually end up going for it, and I think for the right reasons, because so there's a now somewhat accepted wisdom on the Orange website that is Hacker News, that you probably shouldn't start with a microservices architecture for your startup, right? It's that whole thing of do things that don't scale. David Heinemeier Hansen, he says the first rule of distributed computing is don't distribute your computing if you don't absolutely have to, right? Because it introduces a lot of complexity and problems. And whilst micro front ends don't have to deal with a lot of the kind of like temporal complexity that gets introduced in microservices, it's still something that you only want to do if you have to. And in the case of the front end, I don't see compelling performance reasons to end up taking this approach, whereas that may be a valid reason to go to microservices. It's really more of an organizational thing. You're trying to solve a scaling problem in your engineering organization rather than a scaling problem of the tech itself as it's running at runtime.
Yeah.
And then this particular client certainly did not have that problem to solve. They thought it would help them keep their code base better organized. And I think it sounds on paper like a good idea, but it's putting the cart before the horse. Because you can have a well architected, loosely coupled, modularized, single front-end code base, theoretically. But if you still don't, then how is that going to be different if you're doing micro front-ends? How are you going to stop a lot of these implicit, couplings? The technology won't stop you.
I like this. I like that notion. Like I think also, like I've heard Dan Abramoff refer to it as annoyance-driven development. So like just build it out quickly and in a basic manner, and like once it gets to a point where you're pulling out your hair, only then start looking at, okay, how can I make this easier? And I think like Smashing Magazine also does something similar, where I think they have a static site that is kind of built by Hugo Go, I think. And then obviously, so they have lots of other things on top of that, like for example, the online store and membership and so forth. And I think they kind of have what I would maybe call a micro front end approach there, where I think they have these little Preact components that they just kind of inject into the static content that gets generated, which I guess from my side leads to another question, which is, is there something that plays nicely with something like Jamstack, perhaps more than it does with kind of your like more traditional kind of like JavaScript, client-side JavaScript approaches?
I think it's kind of really neither here nor there, right? So I don't. Yeah, it'll work for either of those. Incidentally, module federation is also being worked on in a server-side rendering context. so where you could have, and the reason I mention this is because it might have some bearing on the Jamstack question, where you could have a host micro front end do server-side rendering and still depend on modules from another server, but at render time, and then and then still serve kind of like one HTML thing there that then gets hydrated and works correctly when it does. So that would be when that's not quite ready yet, but when that is ready, that would be a different way to do server-side micro front ends.
Yeah, so I'm specifically, I'm not thinking about kind of like your Next.js's and your Gatsby's and stuff. I'm thinking about like their case where they have like an actual like Go static site generator and the JavaScript. Just they have these little containers, embedded pieces of JavaScript here and there for like the cart and so forth. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that could totally work. The trick is, are those bits and pieces independently deployable? So is it currently the kind of situation where at build time, as part of the build process, they import a specific version of that component? Or is it the kind of thing where there's just a URL to load that JavaScript, a URL of the kind where it's effectively just latest. Give me whatever's the latest. And then run that. If it's independently deployable, then it's micro frontends. If not, then it's almost less. It's less of a technical approach than it is an organizational thing. Yeah,
and I think where I may be going wrong is I'm trying to figure out kind of where this approach might make sense, and I think maybe that's the wrong way of thinking about it. Is that given like just like a smorgasbord of options, like you generally might not necessarily go with this, because there are some trade-offs. This is not necessarily a solution in itself. It's a possible solution to a problem that you might have. And it's you don't necessarily do this for the sake of building a microfront and like architecture.
Yes. So I do think it's an evolution in front-end architecture, but I don't think it's the kind of like natural thing that everyone should default to. Far from it. I think it's going to be just like microservices. It's like, don't do this unless you're pretty sure that you've got some problems that it would solve, because it is more complicated. You now do introduce risk that somebody can deploy something that'll end up breaking because of mismatches in versions. You have to be a lot more considerate about how you evolve the contracts between the different moving parts of your solution. Whereas if it's an integrated build time thing, you don't have to be as worried about that, assuming you test things as a whole. Because the whole thing about independently deploying stuff is that you don't test them as a whole.
Yeah.
Right.
And I guess this is something that makes more sense once you reach a certain level of scale, because I know specifically once you get to these really big teams, like you almost so I'm thinking of a specific example here where you would have an entire like Scrum team just for like the cart,
exactly,
or for the login, or for the like user management, like or whatever. And I think there it maybe makes sense. So you don't need to have like discussions around kind of when do we deploy, batching it in, so I think it, like once you reach a certain scale, it kind of leads to more like continuous integration and continuous delivery. But like I think there are trade-offs, like obviously in some ways it's going to make your life harder if you can't have like almost like kind of a sanity check in terms of how everything plays together before you deploy.
Yes.
But then like having that maybe slows down kind of shipping things and so forth. So, but once again, to me, this is like something that would become a problem at a very specific scale, and not necessarily the scale that I work at as a contractor.
No, I think I was lucky in that I worked for kind of a consulting dev company that had a really big client, a major retailer in the UK that's been around for a long time. And I don't know exactly how many teams there were working on different front ends at the time, but I'm going to hazard a guess, and I'm going to say it's about 10, if not more. Right, and those teams weren't purely front end teams. It was the typical kind of like multifunctional team where you managed your own back end and you managed your own front end, but yet everyone had to integrate and create this like seamless experience nevertheless.
Yeah, and it does also maybe make more sense. And so I use the example of Smashing Magazine, where you have like a specific product that has like different facets to it. So they have the books, they have the actual blog articles, then they have kind of like their conference and event stuff, and and so forth. So those are essentially like different products within themselves, probably with their own like product owners and teams and so forth. Yeah,
exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So there's a specific question here around, is it possible to use micro-frontends with multiple JavaScript frameworks, for example, Angular and React? So I think you did speak to this a bit, but like maybe more in terms of this question, what are the limitations that you can expect when you use multiple frameworks?
So this is definitely possible. You can use whatever frameworks you want. The thing to keep in mind is, one, you're going to be shipping more code, right? You're now shipping several different ways of rendering HTML to the DOM. So there is a trade-off there. You're trading off flexibility and team autonomy for a little bit of loading performance. You need to make sure that things that these frameworks normally expect to own that they don't tread on each other's toes. So routing is one of those examples, that they don't tread on each other's toes there. Even if you're using the same frameworks, incidentally, there can be some problems. Only recently did React really bring in support for running different versions of React on the same page. You can do this now in recent versions of React, but in version 16 and below, you couldn't. React would get very confused if you did that. I don't know enough about Angular to know whether or not you can run more than one different version of Angular on a page at the same time. I don't know if it would get confused or not. But yeah, a big thing would be the routing. That's typically something that they expect to own. Now, I know React itself doesn't know about routing, but there's very few React projects that don't use React Router. So there you'd have to make sure that it's only caring about a particular set of routes, and then you'll be safe. But that is then one of those things that you kind of need to care about, and kind of have an implicit contract that you don't mess with that.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of part of the problem is that, so when I thought about that, like I thought about, okay, cool, you can probably still use something like React Router, and then instead of having it at the topmost level, like kind of in your app JSX, you just kind of have your routes like embedded on a more like component basis, and you just kind of evaluate those routes as if it's kind of like a global scope or something. I guess the problem there is that, if anything anywhere changes that, like, because routes are by definition global, so if one component, that to me feels like something very dangerous.
So you could be intelligent about it in the sense that maybe the root component of your micro frontend has a property that is its base path. And then whatever your host or container frontend is, when it mounts this micro frontend, it explicitly tells it, hey, this is your base path now. So there are ways to abstract that out and make that a little bit easier to deal with. But even then, it's easier to think about if you have a situation where it's like, oh, this set of routes is just handled by that team and they use React, and this other set of routes is handled by the team B and they use Angular. It's a little bit more complicated if you have, let's say, the cart scenario. Let's say the shopping cart's built in Angular, but the product page is built in React. And how do certain routes now play into this scenario? What if you wanted to reflect the fact that something was added to the cart in the URL somehow, or that the cart, maybe there's a little sidebar that slides open after something's been added to the cart, that's open. If you want to reflect that in the URL, now it becomes complicated because they both want to touch the routing.
Yeah, so I guess, I guess this would, and I think the more you're kind of like sharing your own experience around this and so forth, I think the more I'm realizing this isn't necessarily something you would potentially pursue.
There is actually, regarding the routing, there is an in-progress effort to create a new application navigation API as a web standard.
I saw that.
That would actually help
by
with
Jake Archibald. Yeah,
that would actually help with
exciting.
this. But I mean, progress there is slow. They've been chatting for years.
It moves at web speed, which is my grandkids might be able to use it.
We finally got container queries like 12 years later, right? We got it.
Well, we got the spec. Now it just needs to actually become production ready.
Yeah, but Safari shipped it, which
I guess, yeah. But I think that's Jen Simmons. Maybe some of that. We got container queries. Like I think touche. But I think for me, I'm just realizing that this isn't necessarily something that you would intentionally pursue. You wouldn't intentionally go like, cool, like, next level front end, let's have all three frameworks. They're good on their own. Having all three of them, that's going to be triple the amount of goodness. Like, to me, that's like not necessarily something you would pursue, but I think you do end up in these situations for whatever reasons. So I think this is once again coming back to that point of, like, it sounds like micro-frontends aren't a solution within themselves, but it's maybe a possible solution to problematic places where you might find yourself.
Yeah. I mean, the chief purpose is to unblock teams that would otherwise be depending on each other to get stuff done, right? Right, because it's difficult. Like if you're working on a team and some other team is like, hey, so we have this important thing to do, and in order to do that, you guys need to change something, and you're like, okay, cool, but have you seen the size of our backlog? And guess what? Like, our KPIs are related to that backlog and not your backlog. So it can be difficult to get stuff done in larger organizations sometimes. It can take time, and it can take convincing and glad handing and politics, and it's just slow. So it's really more of a solution to that problem than it is to any technical problem.
And I think for me, like, I also need to keep in mind that it's probably not that useful in terms of the things that I work on day in, day out. Like, this is probably useful. So let me actually pull up that comment. So Gerd has actually shared, about like it being used in Azure in the portal, and I think that's a good point. So my guess is this would also probably be more useful when you have things like so kind of like WebSocket stuff happening and so forth. Maybe have like something being streamed and so forth. You have these almost like little almost like little browsers within your page, like almost like little widgets. I guess what you would maybe back in the day have like a Java applet or something for.
It doesn't have to be that dynamic, though. It can be. It very much can be. And in the case of Azure, that very much is the case. AWS console would be another case. But if you look at something like the Amazon store, that also is created using micro-frontends, except it's much closer to the old school server-side includes way of doing things. Because, I mean, it's just a store. It just needs to, apart from the cart, it just needs to list static stuff. There isn't a lot of actual dynamic interop that needs to happen there. So there it also works.
Yeah, and I think also like we probably do more micro-front-end-ish stuff than we realize. Like once you start thinking about third-party things, so if you pull in that little, that every single site nowadays has, where it's like kind of that live support chat thing in the bottom right corner that just like pops up. For all intents and purposes, that's a micro-front end. It might not be something that you intentionally deploy, but like I think it plays along the exact same rules.
It is. I would say that's a micro-front end for the person that's providing that component. If you're consuming it, I would struggle to say you've adopted an architectural style of independently deployable, right?
I thought I could be one of the cool kids.
No, just adding Google Tag Manager to your site does not make micro-frontends.
I've been doing micro-frontends now for 10 years already. Right. So I think like there's an interesting question by Jonathan regarding like testing. So how would you handle? So I think unit tests, I guess, is pretty self-explanatory. But how would you handle things like integrated testing and end-to-end testing and so forth in such an architecture?
Yeah, so you should definitely do as much of that as you can. The more confidence you have that your complete end-to-end kind of thing is working, the better you're going to be. But it's also one of those scenarios where you don't necessarily test everything as a whole. In a lot of these cases, that might be too complicated to do. It might be too difficult to do. The situation that I was in at the retailer, we did have like a test environment, but it was difficult to really, that text environment was also constantly in flux with different people doing different versions of stuff. So I hesitate to call that like a specific integration test between one change and another change. So you do rely on it, but at the same time, you also want to focus more on gracefully upgrading the way that things integrate with one another in backwards compatible ways. So it's very similar to the way you might think about evolving an API, like a network API. Ideally, you don't ever want to have to version your network API. Ideally, you don't make any backwards incompatible changes. And one of the big reasons for that is that you can then deploy a new version of the backend without having to worry about updating everyone's clients. And it's very similar with micro-frontends. You want to be able to do that. So integration testing helps with that because it'll help you catch those problems. But also doing things in typed languages helps a lot with this as well, or some other forms of contract-driven development. Types are kind of one way of doing that. You could also, in a network APIs, you might use an open API spec on and fire that at the backend and fire that at the front end. In a way, that's an integration test. Not really, because you're not actually using those pieces, but it is an integration test. So yeah, but on the other hand, you can do an integration test using a whole bunch of mocks. So that's also a valid approach to take, and that would certainly tell you that it's independently deployable. So yeah, it is a thing, and you should do as much of it as you can. But still, you need to be able to deploy the thing independently.
And I think that brings, so I was also thinking about this now, like how I would approach it. And I guess like I like at the start you kind of spoke about custom events, you know, and that's maybe a good approach where you just like fire a custom event that just bubbles all the way, up. And, if like you just agree with whatever team is maintaining that thing, that it's just going to catch that event. You have agreed upon schema in terms of there's maybe 3 types of events. There's like add item, there's like go to checkout, and something maybe else. And that's all like you just have that agreement, those 3 events, and what the other team that maintains that piece of UI does with those events. We've been doing this with kind of API calls, so now you're essentially just doing API calls between different parts of your front end instead of between the front end and the server.
So I would call that, so the analogy is not quite a call. So a call is you're pulling information. Whereas events is you're pushing information.
Yeah. But I mean, kind of that contractual approach.
Yeah, there's a contractual nature to it. What's nice about issuing events that way is there could be a team C later on that you don't really know about. That's like, hey, it would be handy to do some kind of integration with when something's added to cart. Maybe team C handles the recommendations.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
They're not the product team. They handle the recommendations. Maybe
or just
when something's added to cart, but maybe when something's added to cart, they dynamically recalculate the recommendations at the bottom. They could listen to that event.
I'm also curious whether there's maybe like some interesting things here, like in terms of, and I immediately thought of that when you mentioned iframes, is, whether there's something interesting here with maybe like web workers or kind of just the post message API.
So in iframes, you would use post message because you have to. You wouldn't be able to bubble a custom event out of an iframe. You would have to use post message. With web workers, a use case for using post message as a communication API between different micro-frontends hasn't popped out at me. Interestingly enough, what I have seen with web workers is a variation of server-side includes on micro-frontends because you in the web worker, in the service worker, you can manipulate these API requests. So you could basically say, okay, cool, the kind of header bit, we dynamically in the service worker add that to the response from a micro front end, which actually only just gives us its bit.
Interesting.
So you could do that on the client.
So maybe so you would maybe like add the authentication like token or something. So then whoever's like maybe working on this little piece of front end never needs to deal with kind of like the user and like getting their access token or whatever. They just push it out and that gets intercepted and it gets added before it gets sent via the API.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
that's super interesting.
There are actually some opportunities in web workers to do that. But again, I haven't really seen like a super well fleshed out approach and like well thought out and well considered approach to that yet. It is still early days for a lot of this.
And to be honest, like like all these examples that I'm thinking of is probably much easier to kind of just maintain and solve with existing tools. But I think for me, it's just like curious kind of thinking about, but like once again, this isn't necessarily a situation that you would actively seek out. But for whatever reason, you might, because let's say, authentication is handled by some monolith. And you are writing something in, Vue or whatever, and you're using like Magento or whatever that does its own like weird authentication that you can't easily expose to the JavaScript client side. So those are kind of, I guess, the situations where something like this would be useful, but it's not necessarily something that you seek out to actually be in. Given like just blue skies, you'd probably just like fire up like Remix or Next.js or something instead. Yeah. Okay. There is a question around like how would you manage state? I think you have spoken to this a bit, but I don't know if you maybe want to kind of expand on that a bit. How would you maintain state independently in these micro front ends?
So I would strongly favor an approach where each micro front end manages its own state and they only communicate via passing messages. And if the philosophy behind message passing is that you're just sending values, you're not sending references to pieces of state. You're sending plain values out.
Like payloads.
Or copies of information, not references to information. Even though you could at a technical level just pass a reference, you could do that. I don't think that's a great idea. So that's my strong preference. Having said that, it is possible to share state. The dirtiest way would be to just have some global window.state big object that all the micro front ends know exists and manipulate and read at their whim. You could do that, and I wish you luck, but don't do that.
For various reasons, this is one of them, but loads of other reasons not to do that.
So I mean, data changing out from underneath you at runtime is one problem, but another problem is that it's very easy for that structure of that state to become ossified. It's the same way if several backends share a database, or if they integrate via a database, that structure becomes ossified because there's a lot of coordination effort required if there's a refactoring necessary. Both in terms of that everything that integrates with that data needs to change and be deployed to change. The change needs to be deployed at the same time, but the design of that change needs to now be coordinated between all the teams that depend on it, and they need to do the work at roughly the same time. It's just very complicated. Don't do that. If you just really don't.
Yeah. So I'm curious whether you know of any good examples of micro frontends. So I did mention some that I think kind of follows this approach, but that's just kind of off the top of my head. I might be wrong. I stand to be corrected, and some of it might have changed since. But yeah, that's just from memory. I don't know if you maybe have some examples where this is used successfully. So I also remember someone mentioned Azure as well, the Azure Portal. Yeah, I don't know if you know of any other kind of products that do this.
So like I mentioned, Amazon, there's someone that does this. In a way, you could say that Google does this because there is some stuff that's shared in different pieces of their UI in a kind of live way. Like if you're switching from Google Drives to Google Docs, there's definitely some shared interface stuff that happens there. But there are also separate products. What would be another one? I have seen in practice more of the old school ways of doing things rather than the newer way of doing the stuff at runtime. It's also a little bit harder to tell if you didn't build it, whether or not exactly. It's hard to tell whether or not some big corporation that clearly has separate teams working on different features, whether they could independently deploy those features. It's not that easy to know unless they come out and say it.
Yeah, I guess, and once again, this brings us back to this thing about it's actually more a business concern than a technical concern. It's how you structure your teams, how you structure deliverables, kind of how you structure your sprints, and like your deployments and integrations and those type of things. Which once again, like for me is not necessarily the level that I work at. But if you're kind of working at some big organization, like this is definitely something that can, like, I guess, fit well into kind of your kind of process, especially if you I'm always amazed by how many like big companies I've worked with where there's a single person that has to push a button for things to show up in production. And then that person gets sick and for like basic bug fixes just like take months to go out.
So that's another reason that decoupling this kind of thing is a good idea. The less teams need to coordinate, the less they're impacted by these kinds of unforeseen absences.
Cool. So I think maybe I just quickly want to share. So I think that seems like it's most of the questions. I think Justin has been lurking a bit in the background. Justin, I don't know if you maybe have any questions on your side around this.
No, nothing from me. I think you covered most of the things I had on my mind and people in the chat. So yeah.
So I want to just kind of touch on like how to what extreme you could kind of take this approach. I have seen some examples of micro-frontends where you have kind of a container front end and then you have front ends for different features. And then the component library was effectively turned into a whole series of micro-frontend, each component being its own micro-frontend, right? Yeah. And effectively, the latest version of that component being loaded at runtime to be used by all these other different micro-frontends. That really was more of a proof of concept because, of course, from a performance perspective, this creates quite the loading waterfall. Like it ends up cascading where the container micro-frontend needs to load first, and then the feature micro-frontend needs to load then, and then the components that it uses at a top level are loaded, and then the ones that those use need to be loaded, and it's a little silly. It doesn't actually make anything faster, but it was an interesting kind of concept.
Yeah, and I guess if you're doing this progressively as well, you probably have 100-page reflows before you even see anything on the screen. So,
yes, that with everything running on your local, it was fine, but in practice, that wouldn't have been a great idea. I still think even if you're doing micro-frontend, it's probably a lot better to have a shared component library, ideally also exported as web components so that you're not tied into a single framework. But I would probably bake that in at build time for each micro front end, right? So if there's an upgrade to the component library, it only really cascades to each micro front end when they do their latest updates, and individually, not automatically.
Yeah, and I think like so for me, like on my own kind of web components journey, I think initially the way I did approach web components was very much kind of through the lens of something like React, where you kind of have state, and and state kind of flows through your app from kind of top down, like kind of in a single direction outwards, and I've just kind of realized that actually that's a pain to do with web components, just because like it's very hard moving anything that isn't a primitive value or a string around, because you need to kind of like stringify things, parse them, or do some weird, because it's very hard to get anything that isn't a string into, like, it's almost like the API for web components, because it's based on attributes, like it's, unless you want to do like weird things with mounting it and then like passing the prop after it's been mounted and so forth. So I think I've kind of started actually going into this kind of route, like just by nature of that being such a pain, where I start actually just treating like whatever API that is, whether that's like IndexedDB or like a REST API or whatever, as the actual source of truth. And and the web component itself, it mounts and it just talks to that API, without being aware of anything around it, just because it's such a pain to actually pass things around between components in web components, unless you're using something like Stencil.
You can do props though with web components. Properties, you can do that.
Yes, but it needs to be strings. Well, no. So, but like the problem there is your like I assume you're actually like creating that component by means of like an actual HTML tag.
Right. Right. Okay. No,
so exactly. So then you need to wait for it to mount and have like
and
some
then get a reference to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So it's just like I've just been kind of like trying to get my brain around how to do this, and I just think I've come to the conclusion that like just passing things around between components is just a pain with web components. So I think by nature it actually steered me into this direction, where like the state is something like a central point that all the components talk to, and like not kind of and being encapsulated from one another.
So I would like, so if in the case of a server-side API, I think that will work quite well, and that's because you're doing message passing. But in the case of IndexedDB, you can run into a lot of the same problems, because that's global shared state effectively. So from an architectural perspective, that can present some serious challenges. Yeah.
No, but like, that like, so I think I have the same thing with web components that I maybe have with kind of micro-frontends here, where like I just find the technology so interesting, that I'm trying to retroactively come up with problems to solve with it.
So, as we've been talking about this, humorously, a parallel between micro-frontends and blockchains occurred to me in the sense that I think for many people it's a solution in search of a problem, and
no, sure, but I think like it's the exact same thing here, where there are cases where you're in some weird situation where there's a lot of legacy code or whatever, and you need to add something to that interface, but you can't rebuild the entire architecture. Then these type of things like web components or micro-frontends and so forth is going to come in really handy. I think the problem is just like my brain tends to think in terms of like just like architecture. So I don't necessarily think in theory or hypothetically about like kind of those weird spaces. I'm just like, okay, cool. How would I set up a boilerplate for this type of project? Yeah, which I guess is the wrong approach to it. Cool. So I think maybe just to end this off, I also see that Jonathan also just commented that he just also wants to like give a big like thank you and shout out to kind of a lot of the discussion. Like, and I started out with this, like you're pretty active on ZA Tech. And like I always appreciate your insights into kind of these type of things. So I just also want to echo Jonathan's sentiment here. So yeah, thanks so much for that. Yeah, sorry, did you want to respond to that?
It's a pleasure. Probably on ZA Tech a little bit more than I should be. Sometimes when I'm a little bored or there's some work I don't want to do or something along those lines, I'll be like, I wonder what's happening on ZA Tech.
Yeah.
And then someone will be wrong on the internet, and I have to.
Yeah. And that someone is never yourself.
Yeah, never.
Yeah, cool. So that's all of it from my side. It also seems like kind of we've gone through all the questions. Justin, I don't know if there's maybe anything you want to add in closing. Just kind of maybe mention again the upcoming events.
Yeah, just thanks again to Xandor for joining us. That was really great. Upcoming events, we have a Q&A with Stephanie Steinmack. And then we have we'll be also planning a hackathon weekend. But as I said earlier, dates to be confirmed. We will post those when they are ready. Yeah, so just thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. Yeah. Scott?
Is the Q&A, do we have a date for that yet?
No, I'm still waiting for Stephanie to get back to me, but it'll be in July.
Awesome. Okay, cool. All right. Thanks so much, Xandor. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and keep warm and keep safe, and then we will chat to you in July again. All right.
Thanks, everyone.